Welcome back to Newsmax Now. Historic talks in Havana as President Obama and President Raul Castro meet face-to-face for only the fourth time.
We continue, as President Castro indicated, to have some very serious differences, including on democracy and human rights. And President Castro and I have had very frank and candid conversations on these subjects.
While President Obama pushed Cuba to improve its human rights record, Cuban President Raul Castro denied his country had any political prisoners.
Give me a list right now of the political prisoners to free them. What political prisoners? Give me a name or the names. Or when this meeting ends, give me a list of the names. And if they are indeed in prison, they will be released before the night is through.
President Castro hit back, saying the United States has double standards on the issues of human rights and that no country meets all international rights agreements. Google announced a joint venture that will provide internet and smartphone technology to that country. Cuba has one of the lowest rates of internet use in the world, estimated to be only 5%. The project is mostly symbolic, but it is an important move for a country that has long maintained strict control of internet access. The internet giant became the first American company to publicly display its sign on a building in Havana. And a CBS New York Times poll shows a majority of Americans think the United States should reestablish diplomatic ties with Cuba. 55% believe the government should end the trade embargo against that country. Completely normalizing relations, though, as you know, would be difficult. However, as a majority of Americans want that U.S. military prison on Guantanamo Bay to continue to operate. And that's where we want to welcome in today's roundtable guest, political and economic analyst Raul Mas and Newsmax chief Washington correspondent John Gizzi. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us here on this Monday.
Thanks for having us, Miranda.
Raul, let's start with you. You live and work in Miami, where there are a large number of people who escaped Cuba, including the father of Republican presidential candidate Ted Cruz. What does President Obama's visit mean to you and the people that you converse with on a day-to-day basis?
Listen, I think the community is somewhat split right now. There is, I'd say the majority of Cuban Americans are still very skeptical, although there is a rather vocal, large minority that are sort of welcoming the president's moves. And I think, look, at the end of the day, whether you want an opening with Cuba or you don't want an opening with Cuba, I think what we all want is to see freedom and democracy to return as part of any sort of overture towards the Castro brothers. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, what we haven't seen so far is that happening, quite frankly. I mean, this has been, ever since the president announced this, effort over a year ago, basically a one-sided effort on the part of the United States to open the doors to Cuba for international trade and commerce with business partners here in the U.S., with financial interests here in the U.S., and absolutely nothing being done to further human rights in Cuba, to further democracy in Cuba. And as recently as literally hours before the president arrived, Castro's henchmen were rounding up dissidents, beating them, throwing them in the back of a police van, carting them off to jail. And I just find it ironic that at this stage, I mean, this man has the gall to say that there are no political prisoners in Cuba, right, and that the president would tolerate that. I mean, it's just, quite frankly, sickening, okay? Sickening for somebody who has, seen the agony and the suffering with my own eyes. Right. I've lived through the experience for decades.
John, I want to bring you into this conversation. I want to go back to something Raul brought up about business, because that's a large part of this trip. A small group of Republican lawmakers actually accompanied the president during this trip to Cuba in hopes of establishing some trade opportunities. What's been the reaction from your standpoint on Capitol Hill to them siding with the president?
Well, it's mixed, just as Raul said it is in the Cuban community. It is certainly divided in terms of the response of Republican members of Congress. Congressman Reed Ribble of Wisconsin, himself a businessman who was part of the delegation to Cuba, strongly endorses an opening as an opportunity for fresh business. On the other hand, Congressman Robert Pittenger of North Carolina, an occasional guest on Newsmax TV and chairman of the Republican Conference on Terrorism, cites the abysmal human rights record of the Castro brothers, noting, for example, that human rights groups have already submitted a list of 51 political prisoners in jail and demanding their release. So far, there's been no action on it. So I'd have to say more Republicans than not want to continue the hard line against the Castro regime, but as Congressman Ribble demonstrated, there are those who favor the opening.
Raul, do you see any changes, any chance of things getting better? Maybe that list that John was just bringing up of some of those prisoners being released, do you see that changing in any way in the coming months?
Listen, I hope so, Miranda, but the truth of the matter is that, I'm very, very skeptical of this president, okay? There was a terrific article in the Atlantic Monthly that came out recently talking about why Obama wanted to go to Cuba. And it's very evident from reading that article that President Obama's sympathies, quite frankly, lie with revolutionary governments throughout the world that were supported by communist dictatorships over the past decades. That's why he went to Mandela's funeral. That's why he shook hands with Raul Castro at that funeral, because he has sympathy for these revolutionary anti-colonial movements throughout the world. That is his worldview. That is why he is in Cuba. And you know what? Let's not forget that Cuba is a country of about 11 million people, okay? The economic impact towards the U.S. in terms of possible trade deals or business is minuscule. We're not talking about China here, for Christ's sakes. We're talking about a tiny little country 90 miles from our shore. And if we can't, as the superpower of the region, demand some fundamental changes in exchange for access to our markets, then quite frankly, we are weaker than even Donald Trump would have us believe.
Raul Mas, John Gizzi, thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. Pleasure to have you as always.
Thank you.
It's a presidential election like none other, and if March is any indication of what's to come, riots, talk of third-party candidates, and calls for a certain GOP leader to resign, well, we're in for a very explosive summer. We'll discuss all what's at stake coming up during today's roundtable. You don't want to miss it.